Okay, good afternoon from Southwest Michigan. Uh, my name is Josh Haas. I'm the Vice Chair for the Hawk Migration Association of North America, and we're very excited to be with you again for another in our Lunch and Learn series. So this month is a little bit near and dear to my heart. We're featuring Nick Alioto, who's done a fair amount of work with the Mackinaw Straits Raptor Watch, as you can see on the screen here. I've noticed we do have a few of our MSRW supporters with us today, so welcome to you guys, as always, as another great partner of HMANA. And so we're excited to have Nick here, who's doing some really interesting research on red-tailed hawks. We've had a few different presentations featuring red-tailed hawks, but I assure you this is not one you want to miss. So I'm glad you made the decision to be with us today. And it's some really interesting work that Nick is doing. Before we get ahead of ourselves, just a reminder, we are recording today and streaming this live to Facebook if you haven't noticed. You will also notice that you do not have the ability to unmute yourself. That is absolutely on purpose. And what we want to do is really encourage you guys to open up that chat window through the button at the bottom of your Zoom and get that chat window open, and please engage with us. Not only will we ask that you use that to ask any questions that you have of Nick today, but also use that to tell us where you're calling in from and where maybe your local Hawk Watch might be. So again, just as a reminder, use that chat to ask your questions to Nick. The famous Julie Brown will take those questions and facilitate the question and answer time at the end today. Let's see, with that, one last thing about Zoom. If you're not liking the current view that you have in the upper right-hand corner, you can click on View, and there's a few choices there between Speaker and Gallery View or just the standard view that you can choose from to customize your viewing experience. With that, I will turn it over to Julie Brown, one of our directors, and I will let her introduce herself as well as Nick Alioto. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Josh. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have Nick here today. Nick is a graduate student in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife at Michigan State University, and he's originally from Ontario. He's been working with raptors since 2017 and became interested in red tails while he was working with the Mackinaw Straits Raptor Watch. He'll be focusing today on his ongoing research on the movement ecology of red-tailed hawks that utilize the Straits of Mackinac, and he'll discuss how this project started, why he's interested in studying them and their migration in that area. And he'll also touch on what we've learned through the first year of tracking red-tails in the Straits region, including info on their breeding, wintering distributions, and the migratory routes they use. Also, what has been done so far this year, 2022, and what questions he hopes to answer with his research. So take it away, Nick.
All right, thanks, Julie and Josh, and thanks, HMANA, for having me. It's exciting to be able to be part of this Lunch and Learn series. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about my research today on red-tailed hawk movement through the Straits of Mackinac. So just to start, I want to give you a little more background on myself. So I graduated with my undergrad in 2016 from Bishop's University in Quebec. So I'm a Canuck. And then after 2016, since then I've been traveling over the United States and Canada, working with various nonprofits and different organizations, gaining a bunch of bird experience, and they've all been either at observatories or doing some sort of movement related work with birds. So I've always been fascinated in migration and movement ecology. So that's kind of been my my stream of focus. And during that time, I started working with the Mackinaw Straits Raptor Watch back in 2017, and just kind of realized how great of a spot this was for raptor migration. So then luckily we were able to start this project, and I'm now a student at Michigan State. And so it's a nice collaboration with MSRW Michigan State, and then I'm also a collaborator with the Red-tailed Hawk Project. So that's kind of my small journey to get to where I am at now. And so yeah, as Julie mentioned, today the presentation outline, First, I just want to, talk about the project and kind of the inception behind it, why we wanted to start this study. And then I'm going to, just touch on some of the objectives that we hope to answer with the research I'm doing. Then I'm going to talk about what we did in 2021. So that was our first year of the project when we started putting out transmitters, what we learned and saw. And then I'll talk about what we did just this past field season in 2022. Okay, so a little bit more on the background and the objectives. So as you guys are all well aware, my study species is the red-tailed hawk. According to the IUCN, they're at least concerned species, so that pretty much means that they don't have any special status, that they're plentiful in the wild. And as we can see, looking at the map up here in the top left, they have a cross-continental range, which is pretty amazing. They span coast to coast all the way down into Mexico and Central America. And throughout their whole range, there's currently 14 recognized subspecies. And the map up here to the right just kind of shows you, from work done by my collaborators, kind of how those subspecies are dispersed across North America and kind of where we, where they, what their distribution's like and kind of the contact zones in between them. So they're really amazing species, just the diversity in plumages among them. And what's particularly interesting is that red tails are really understudied, especially in the eastern portion of the range. There's been some work done on them in the west, but in this whole portion of eastern North America, especially in Michigan and the Great Lakes, there really hasn't been a lot done on them. So it just serves as a great spot to answer some questions about them. And then just some threats that red tails face. There's climate change. So as the climate is warming up, this could have effects on their migration routes and their timing. This could also have effects to their their breeding grounds and their wintering grounds. And then of course there's anthropogenic effects. So as we continue to humans expand, this could we're not just habitat degradation for red tails, but also we could be affecting different areas they use throughout migration, along with their wintering grounds. And so some of the reasons I think they're a great species to study is that, number one, they can serve as a model species. Looking at these maps, we see how distributed they are and diverse they are. So that, obviously they're very successful since they're found pretty much everywhere. And studying them, we can use information to learn from them to study other raptor species that are in these same areas that maybe aren't as successful, as well as just looking at migration across the whole continent, which is really interesting. Another reason is keep common birds common. When I worked in Northern Ontario, one of the guys that ran there, he'd always say that every day, and it's true. We should study birds while they're common, and we can, instead of focusing waiting until they're threatened or have they're in danger before we start really heavily studying species. And then finally, like I touched on, there's just really a lot we don't know about them. So studying the red tail, there's just so many questions that we can really try to answer, and it's almost endless. So there's just a ton to learn still. And so a lot of people don't know, but a great spot to find red tails, even though they're found across all of North America, is right in northern Michigan. So the Mackinaw Straits Raptor Watch is a nonprofit organization, and they conduct standardized spring and fall hawk counts. And so just looking at the numbers, this is just from 2021. They saw almost, they counted almost 70,000 birds coming through, crossing the straits on their northbound migration. And of that, there's almost 20,000 red tails. So it's incredible the amount of red tails you can see here. And it really is a novel sight. There's other hawk watches that see good numbers of red tails, but not in the same density that you observe up here in the straits. And what kind of sparked our interest in studying red tails here is that we see there's so many more in the spring, and then when we flip to the fall, not only do the total numbers of birds drop, but the number of red tails decreases substantially. Still a lot, but you'd expect that a lot of these birds would be coming through the same pathways, which we'll talk about as what their migration strategies actually are. And then just looking at the total red tails count in 2021, almost 24,000. It's just a really remarkable sight. So that is these are the reasons that we wanted to study this species in this area and really, notice that this is just a spot they really like using. And so that kind of ties into the migration strategies of what we know about red-tailed hawks. So red-tails are obligate migrants, and so obligate migrants are birds that kind of have an innate, drive to migrate. So their timings are very consistent from year to year, and when they arrive, they have high site fidelity. So they arrive, usually at the same breeding and wintering grounds, and that's in opposite to facultative migrants, which are considered your more eruptive migrants, so things like snowy owls or the winter finches, where the timing of migration isn't always consistent, or the number of individuals where they're going and how many are moving. And then a little more about things we know about their migration strategies. Red tails, there's a spectrum of wing morphology from low aspect to high. Red tails fall in the low aspect range, so the large broad wings, which are great for soaring. And so these soaring migrants, they use thermals. And so thermals, as a lot of you know, is just when the sun heats the surface of the earth, causing the warmer air that's less dense to rise. And these birds can move from thermal to thermal to minimize energy expenditure, which is critical during a long migratory journey. And this is as opposed to high aspect ratio wing birds, so things like harriers and falcons, which don't necessarily rely on soaring migration as much. And so because of these strategies and their physiology, red tails avoid large open water crossings, and the reason is because thermals don't form as well over water. Water just the light just heat when the sun reflects or hits the water, just kind of goes through, doesn't reflect as much off as it does on land, and so that causes less thermals to form over water, so it's more dangerous. So if these soaring migrants undertake crossings where conditions aren't ideal, where say there's a strong crosswind, or there's it's cloudy and there's no thermals or anything they can soar on, they'll have to a lot of times resort to powered flapping, which costs a lot of energy. And there's been a lot of documented cases of raptors that make these dangerous crossings and will actually crash into the water and drown. So it's a really a big risk for these guys to take. So that's one of the reasons we see them concentrate in the Straits, is because that's such a narrow concentration point for them to cross a small expanse of water before reaching land again. And so this was just a little animation for those of you to just kind of show when, as the thermals develop, they rise up and they move from thermal to thermal, saving energy and not flapping. So that's a nice little visualization. And so just looking at what we know about migration in the Straits region. So we know in spring that, talking about water avoidance, we have the Great Lakes, which are huge ecological barriers. And so we know that during spring migration, red tails work their way up to the Straits, stop over, circle around, wait for conditions to be right before they cross over, and then disperse into their breeding territory. So that's kind of what we witness when we get these huge high concentrations during the spring. And so what happens in the fall, if you recall, the numbers drastically drop, and that was one of the main reasons. We're like, well, there's probably not some huge mortality event. These birds are probably just using different routes. So, we kind of hypothesized that, maybe some birds, they disperse far enough north that they're just going around Superior, because there's observatories on Superior like Hawk Ridge that see good numbers of red tails. And of course, based on the numbers, we know that some definitely come back through the Straits before heading to their wintering grounds. So this is just, showing that. And then, we hypothesize that, there's probably going to be some that are going to use the southern tail of Ontario to avoid the lakes, and then cross back into Michigan before reaching their wintering grounds, wherever that may be. And then we thought, maybe we'll get some tracks of some birds that are just going to circumvent all the lakes and, and just completely avoid them and not even deal with them, depending on where these birds are wintering, because we really didn't have an idea of what the distribution of their breeding range was going to be like once they crossed. So that's kind of what we thought would be an explanation for this decrease in total birds seen and total red tails seen. And so for my actual project, obviously there's a ton of things we could answer, but specifically with my research, our objectives are one, we want to look at the space use in the Straits region. So we want to see how the birds are using this area that's, it's a really, concentrated area with high numbers. So we want to compare that between spring and fall. And then in turn, this population of red tails that uses the Straits, we also want to see, map their full migration routes, see if they're, going straight up and down through the Straits, or if they're kind of doing these full loops of going around the lakes and then potentially using the Straits just during their spring migration as maybe just a faster way to get back to their breeding grounds, wherever that may be. And then, the third one, just kind of tying it all together, looking at the differences between spring and fall movements, not just in terms of their whole migration cycle, but in terms of the birds, if they do use the Straits, again, what are the differences between the spring and fall crossings and what's going on there. And so how do we go about collecting this kind of data? Well, luckily for us, in the last 25 years, there's been huge advances in these biologging technologies. So for my project, we're using GPS GSM transmitters. And so a lot of you may have heard of satellite transmitters, and those ones, how they're different is that they're online the whole time because they're sending data off of the satellites. As opposed to GSM, these only work when there's cell towers around, so they're a little cheaper. But once the birds enter areas where there is no more cell coverage, then we don't hear from them anymore. So it's it's kind of, we're always anxious once they cross, and we're like, well, we hope they come back in the service next fall because we don't hear from them most of the time. And so what's great about these transmitters, apart from just the detailed location data they collect, they also take environmental and behavioral data. So they measure the bird's acceleration, they take temperature, they measure light intensity. So it's just amazing what these units can collect for their size. And so how we actually attach them, you can think of it as a small little backpack. We use Teflon ribbon, which is a really great material, and it essentially goes up around their neck and under their wings. And we crimp it on with a little aluminum crimp on their breast. And so anytime you're doing a sort of, any sort of study where you're attaching a device like this to a bird, you always want to make sure that it weighs less than 3% of the bird's total mass, so that it doesn't cause any serious effects to the amount of energy they're expending or just their flight behavior. And so in our case, our units that we're using only weigh 15 to 16 grams, so they're well under that 3% threshold. Because I think the smallest red tails we've actually outfitted of only, I think the smallest one was maybe 820 grams, so well within that range. And so what did we do in 2021? So that was the first year of this project. And so just a quick summary, we were luckily able to get enough money to put out 11 GPS transmitters, and they were all deployed in the first 2 weeks of April, which is kind of peak adult red-tailed hawk migration in the Straits, and that was out of 152 captured. So we had a really good sample size of birds to choose from, which ones we wanted to target. And of those, 7 were adult males and 4 were females, and that was determined not just on we took blood for a genetic analysis, but also based on their behaviors on the breeding grounds once these birds came back. And just through the first year of tracking this, I took this total number of fixes about a week ago. So from those first 11 birds, so far we already have over 213,000 fixes, which is incredible. And that's that's not including all of the environmental and behavioral data. So we've really gotten a lot of great stuff through the first year from the initial birds in 2021. And then of those birds, so we're catching these birds up in Mackinaw City, as they're coming up and getting ready to cross. So because we're interested in that crossing behavior, so we got tracks from all 11 crossing in the Straits, kind of seeing what they do. And then what was interesting is in the fall, of all the birds that did return, all of them used the Straits again, except for one, which we weren't really expecting. We really did think that a lot were going to take different routes and not come through the Straits, just because not as many are seen. So that kind of had us thinking that maybe there's other factors at play atmospherically, perhaps, that are affecting their crossing behavior in the Straits. So that's something we're interested in investigating. And so of those, we did have one that actually did migrate through Ontario. So kind of what we were hoping to see, to get a track of a bird avoiding the lakes and using that southern tail of Ontario. And so just to visualize that, this is just a subset of that first group of birds. And I wanted to show these ones because of their routes. So we see their dispersal and where they bred in Canada. So pretty far range, which is highlighted by all these triangles for their breeding locations. And we see that 4 of them, the yellow, blue, orange, and pink, those ones all came back through the Straits. And then the purple one, that one, as you can see, worked its way through Ontario. And what was really interesting is that all 5 of these wintered in Kentucky. And you can see the 4 little black dots in Kentucky, and they were all outside of Lexington, which was pretty remarkable to see. And they were actually within 20 to 30 miles of each other. So, this is the first time we saw this. So maybe we're thinking there's a big concentration of red tails that overwinter in Kentucky. So this was really great to see, this kind of, huge dispersal in the breeding grounds, and then how they all converged on a really small wintering area. But not all of them wintered in Kentucky. And then just, going back to that, looking at their, the water avoidance behavior, having these tracks, if we just zoom in on that subset of birds, we can see, looking here, if you follow the mouse, how these birds cross the straits. And unfortunately, the islands right here don't show up. But a lot of the birds we've been finding actually use the islands that are just north of Mackinaw City. So there's a chain of islands, including Mackinaw Island, and a lot of the birds have been island hopping. And what was really interesting is this one bluebird named Morpheus. And we had a bird do this year. This bird went up, and a lot of you may know that's where Whitefish Point Bird Observatory is, and they also have a hawk count that they run. And so this bird worked its way up there, and it was an older bird, at least 4 or 5 years old. And so it sat up there about 3 or 4 days, and I guess it was thinking about maybe perhaps making that crossing, but that's a big undertaking. That's almost 16 miles from Whitefish Point to Ontario. And then ultimately, which is really cool, we see that it decided, nope, I'm not going to even attempt that. And it just worked its way, pretty much right along the shoreline before crossing into Ontario and going north to its breeding ground. So just getting some of that behavior of, how they're avoiding the water has been really, really great to document. And then for some of the other results, so we had birds that wintered in Kentucky, and then of the other birds that returned, we had birds that wintered in Michigan, which was really interesting to see. So 2 of our adult females, one of them decided to winter kind of in central Michigan, and one right in southern Michigan. And what's interesting is, Michigan has really harsh winters, and kind of where Patagium wintered is kind of right on the southern border of where the snow belt is, so where it's not like an extremely harsh winter. So that was cool to document, see that some of these birds that breed up north just stay in winter and don't do a huge migration. And then both of these birds did use the Straits as well during the fall. So we're seeing a lot of high route fidelity with the Straits being used. And then, just kind of looking at the breeding locations of 9 of the birds that we were able to get locations for. What's really interesting to note is just kind of how far north they went. So I think I should have a arrow. So kind of right here, if you look on the screen where this orange and green triangle are, that's kind of like the transition zone from boreal forest into Hudson Plain habitat, which is, kind of really open, vast, flat, and it's, not a lot of big trees, really foggy and boggy. So it was interesting to get these breeding locations of these birds going that far north, especially this yellow one, which is Trinity. That bird went the furthest north of any of our tagged birds. And what's interesting is right up here, just kind of northeast is Polar Bear Provincial Park, I believe. And so she was about 150, 200 miles from that. So these breeding locations were really interesting to document. Mostly Ontario. We got one in Quebec, one right on the border. So a pretty good distribution of, getting a picture of where these birds are going once they cross. And then, talking about, their strategies of, being obligate migrants, that we expect them to use similar routes and arrive on their breeding grounds at similar times. I thought this was just interesting of the birds that came back through the Straits again this spring. You know, in the first year, we kind of, you know, our efforts of tagging take place during the first 2 weeks of April. That's kind of, like I mentioned, the peak migration period. So we see, you know, that's when all of them pretty much after we tag them, they cross within the next day or two, except for Rowan up here on the left. We tagged him, and then he decided he was going to hang around up in the Straits region for about a week or two before finally crossing. And then when we looked at how these birds crossed this past spring, we see that, you know, they were pretty consistent, you know, within a couple days of each other. Rowan, this year, he decided he was going to just blast through. He didn't stop over at all. And then Harold, which is one of our adult females, which I showed on the previous slide, that wintered in Michigan. That bird actually used the islands and unfortunately got predated in the UP. She was later than last year, which maybe was just more weather driven because the spring was really bad up there weather-wise for birds crossing. And so, you know, this was kind of interesting to document that even as, you know, an older adult bird that's experienced, migration still isn't easy. So the cool thing about these transmitters is it measures, you know, the bird's movement. And so if the bird's not moving for a while, and the transmitter's in service, it'll send a signal to me, you know, letting me know that either a potential mortality event has happened or maybe the transmitter was shed. And so this happened in the UP after the bird crossed from the island. And luckily we were able to recover the body. We presume that it was predated by a great horned owl, but we're not 100% sure. It was found hanging in a tree. And, you know, the silver lining in all this is we were able to recover the transmitter. It was in great condition, and we were able to put it out again this spring. So this was just kind of an interesting thing to happen during this project. And reading on reading through literature, it kind of seems that red-tailed, their only real threat they face, like their only real predator, is a great horned owl. So that was kind of cool to document this spring. And then looking, you know, that continuing on that kind of site fidelity of arriving on their breeding grounds. Unfortunately, a lot of our birds are offline right now, so we can't see what the ones from 2021 did. But the birds that are nesting near cell towers. So Rowan is one of them. He arrived pretty much, you know, within 6 days of the same time. So we see, you know, pretty similar timings. And just looking at this map, this kind of highlights how similar the routes are. So this is like the full cycle for this bird. And you see with the pink route, that was initial tagging up here in Mackinaw. The bird went up right on the north side of Superior, then came back through the Straits, wintered in Kentucky, and then almost had the same identical route before he reached his breeding grounds this past spring. So that was really cool to see. And then our second bird, that is luckily probably near the only cell tower up on the border of northern Ontario and Quebec, Patagium. She was one that wintered in central Michigan, used the Straits again, and she pretty much arrived, you know, almost on the same date. So it's great to get this kind of data to show that these birds are using the same areas, same breeding grounds from year to year of the breeding birds. And so, yeah, 2021 overall was really exciting. You know, all this information was new, and we weren't really sure what we were going to see when we were tagging all these birds, where they were going to go and the routes they were going to use. So 2022, our goal was to put out more transmitters, and we were targeting adults again. And the reason for that is, since, you know, there's been no work done in this region on those birds, we wanted to just kind of get a baseline of what the adults were doing. And plus, adult birds have a better chance of surviving. Their mortality rates are a lot lower than, you know, if we were tagging immature birds. So that was kind of our thought process behind that. So we just finished up our second field season just at the end of May. And, you know, it was great. We were able to put out another 14 new transmitters, plus that one that we recovered from the 2021 bird. And so the difference this year, you know, we were tagging birds that were at least 4 or 5 years in age based on their flight feather molt, like the patterns that we saw when we captured them. But this year we wanted to get a better sample size, or not get a better sample size, but get a kind of an idea of what some of the younger adults are doing. So we tagged 2 younger red tails, or second cycle birds, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So these are birds that look, just like adults, but they potentially don't breed. So we wanted to see how they were using the straits and what their kind of full migration cycles look like through this region. And so just for a lot of you that may not know how to age a younger red-tailed hawk, so after the immatures undergo their first molt cycle, they have adult plumage, but there's characteristics that we look for when we capture them that we can microage them to know that it's a younger adult and presumably not a breeder. So in this picture, you can see this kind of yellowish arrow. Those are showing adult flight feathers that came in the secondary, so they're a lot longer, they're darker, and that subterminal band is a lot thicker. And then beside them, those are juvenile retained feathers. So we see that they're a lot more faded because they've been on the bird for over a year, and that subterminal band is thinner. So that's an indication that these are juvenile feathers. So when we catch them, we look for these patterns in the retention of these juvenile flight feathers as the main criteria, but also red tails, along with a lot of other raptor species, as they age, their eyes darken or change color. So if this isn't, a great characteristic because there's a lot of variation between individuals, but with red tails, they kind of go from this pale yellowish light brown to a really dark, rich chestnut brown as adults. So this bird, aptly named Mackinaw for being tagged in Mackinaw City, had retained flight feathers, and the eye color made sense too. So this was one of our younger birds we tagged of 2. And apart from tagging two younger adults this spring, we also, because we can't transmit every bird, which would be nice, we also we're putting out color bands, not just on adults but on immatures, to kind of get a better idea of what their dispersal looks like, and where they're going. So if you're out birding and you see a red tail with a white color band with a black alphanumeric combo, it was banded in Mackinaw City, and if you report that, that would be great information. So we're hoping to get some resites. We put out over 50 color bands this spring, so hopefully people will see some birds as they come down on their fall migration. And then the cool part with all this data, showing 2D maps is one thing, but I kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what it looks like when we tag these birds and kind of how they what their behavior is like when they're in the straits. So this is one of our birds from 2022 named Sassy, and she was named Sassy because there's the Straits Area Audubon Society, so they're called Sass, and so they thought Sassy would be a good name for a bird. So I'm just going to skip up here to play part of this migrate, part of the crossing behavior. And so this was the next day after we tagged this bird, and as you can see, this is kind of just showing that thermaling behavior. The birds, just kind of going back and forth across the peninsula, testing out thermals, looking for that right air to make that cross across the straits, without having the flapper expend any energy. And so you see in the top right corner, it shows miles per hour, but that's actually not right. It should be meters per second. So it's a lot faster than what it's actually moving. So you have to double that to get the miles per hour. And I also sped this video up. This bird wasn't moving this fast. And the total duration of this, I think, was about an hour and a half of the bird just kind of going back and forth up there. And so if any of you have ever been up in the Straits region during spring migration, this is kind of what you see, but think of this, but you'll see hundreds of red tails doing this sometimes at a time, going back and forth, looking for thermals across. And what you'll see is this bird will eventually gain some altitude and will hit the right thermal, and then we'll just shoot across the straits, which I think is coming up here in a second. But it's really cool, these transmitters, at this point, it's taking a point every minute, so really fine resolution data. And so you see that bird hit a good thermal, and right now it's just coasting across the straits, pretty much right over the bridge. And so we have a lot of great data like this on a lot of the birds, not just doing this over the straits, but also going out over the islands and using the islands as a means to get across the water. And then that bird crosses over and kind of does the same thing, starts to look for more thermals to get back up on. And so it was interesting looking at the actual fine scale data. When that bird first crossed the straits, it was about 400, 500 meters above, the sea level. So it really shot up to get high and then coasted. And as it got right when it got to the right when it got to the Upper Peninsula, it had dropped about 250 meters. So it just was coasting and then just went back down and then had to find more thermal. So it's really that's the kind of behavior we're seeing up there. So really cool stuff. If I had more time, we could watch for an hour as this bird meandered its way through the UP and eventually into Canada. So these birds, a lot of the times they'll do, at least when they cross the straits, they'll do another 50, 60 miles easily in a day. We even had a couple birds that from 2021, right when they crossed, they went to their breeding grounds in northern Ontario. So a lot of them just, if conditions are right, they just make that huge jump. Oops. And so this is just showing tracks of the birds that we tagged in 2022. So as I mentioned, we had 15 tags. So this is not representative of where all the birds ended up. It's just kind of, the triangles just show the last known locations for a lot of these birds before they went out of cellular range. As you can imagine, there's not a lot of cell towers up here, or they're very sporadic. But what is cool is this location up here. This was one of a larger adult female that we tagged, and we know she's a female because she was, one, gigantic, and two, she's been transmitting on her breeding grounds, which is really cool, right up near James Bay, which was an awesome location to document. And she's been spending a lot of time, not so much now, her young seem to have fledged, but a lot of time incubating and just sitting around the nest, not moving a whole lot, which is more typical of female behavior. So this is our second confirmed Quebec breeder, and a really great location. Our one from last year, I didn't superimpose the birds from 2021, but if you can see the mouse, it's kind of just pretty close to one of our birds from 2021. So they were close to each other. And same with right here, this bottom yellow square, you can kind of see it's on the north side of Superior, and that one's actually nested on the same river as one of our birds from 2021, about 15 miles north. So really within close proximity to each other, which was cool to see. And then you may be looking at this green arrow over here and wondering, what bird is that? Well, that's one of our younger adults. So that was one of the interesting things that we wanted to tag these younger birds and see what they're doing. That point was as of, I think, a couple weeks ago, and this bird has pretty much just been wandering around northern Quebec. It hasn't seemed to really settled in a territory, so it doesn't look like it's going to breed, at least as of its last location. And maybe it's just trying to fill a territory that there's not a breeding pair in. And what's also cool is that that's the furthest east that we've documented one of our red tails going. So hopefully it survives through the summer, and it'll be interesting to see how it comes back through. Our bird that used Ontario last year was, in Quebec too. So it would be good to get that track of it going through southern Ontario if it does. And then this is just kind of zooming in on all these birds from this spring. Unfortunately, the map doesn't show the islands out here, but you can kind of just imagine there's a big island right here called Boblo, and then Round Island right here, and then Mackinaw Island where you see a lot of usage. And so what was really interesting to see this spring is, as I mentioned, this spring was really weird weather-wise. We missed a lot of birds just because it was just really bad conditions, and we saw it with a lot of the birds that crossed. That we had birds that went out over the water, as you can see up here, and they either used the islands or they tried to use the islands, and they aborted and came back because conditions weren't right. So they knew it wasn't a good idea to cross. So yeah, we saw a lot of birds use the islands this past spring, which is really interesting. Of course, you see right there in the Straits, a lot of them just making that jump pretty much right across the bridge. And you see this one purple track, and that was our other young bird that we tracked. So let me just skip ahead to the next one. And so this is Bucatini. And after we tagged this bird, we can see that it goes out over the islands over here, and it hung out in the islands for about 3 or 4 days and decided, nope, not going to cross there. Came back to the lower peninsula, hung out up here around for about 2 weeks, and I thought it was going to hang out there for the summer, especially based on its marking. It looks more like a borealis or an eastern bird, not something we'd expect to go so far north. And this bird then crossed, and you can see on the map that it kind of just was wandering around northern Ontario, and then it made a huge jump up into Cochrane, and those of you not familiar with Northern Ontario, that's pretty much like the last town that you can kind of get to before there are no more roads, or you have to take a train anywhere. So that bird went offline. So it'll be interesting to see this fall where it ended up and what it did this summer. So really exciting stuff, tagging these younger birds. So that's been great to see so far. And so, just kind of bringing everything all together, the project objectives for what we're trying to do, to look at the space use between the straits seasonally, and identifying their paths and just the movements in general. I like to think of it, if we bring them all together, that ultimately we're going to promote conservation in the Straits region, because this isn't just an important spot for red-tailed hawks, but this is an important migration corridor for many other raptor species that use it. It's it's obviously a novel red-tailed site, a lot use it, but there's a ton of birds that you can see using this area in the spring, and going along with that, this study is not just going to highlight how important this area is for red tails, for how they use it to fly over or stop over, but it also just is going to highlight the importance of this corridor in general for migration. And at the same time, we're going to be filling in a huge knowledge gap about red-tailed hawks, since they're so understudied, and this is an area where we can see so many. So there's gonna be I think a lot that we're going to get out of this project in the end. And so for more information and project updates on this, the Mackinaw Straits Raptor Watch, they have a website and a Facebook and Instagram page, which I've put links here, but you can easily find those by just Googling. And then, of course, we also are putting updates on the Red-tailed Hawk project, where you can check out not just the work being done here, but work being done across North America on red tails. So those are some places if you want to continue to see the work we're doing. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys all for tuning in, and hopefully you learned something. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Great. That was wonderful. Thank you, Nick, so much. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else did too. And just mimicking what a couple people commented on, we could just watch those tracks all day. I think it's so fascinating to see where actual, birds flew, and just to see their, especially coming close to the strait, and kind of the failed attempts, or in getting that elevational data is just fascinating. I think you could just create a channel with just that data, and we would all be watching it.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Well, we have some questions, so I'll start here. Definitely a lot of great questions. Josh is wondering, given you captured 152 red tails last spring, how did you determine which 11 birds to attach transmitters to?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So whenever we're catching these birds, we not only, when we're inspecting them, we want to make sure they're healthy. So we score their breast muscle, we check them for parasites. We want to put transmitters on the healthiest birds. But we're also, for this project, we were targeting certain subspecies. So, just mentioning how they were so diverse, the birds that we mostly think we're getting migrating through are the Abiatocolas, or the northern subspecies. So when we captured them in hand, we were looking for certain Abiatocola traits. So really heavily marked belly band, a lot of rufous wash in the body, among some other characteristics, and tagging those birds. But then we were also, we get these kind of interesting phenotypes where, they weren't, 100% clear cut, Abiatocola birds, but they had traits. So we were tagging those birds because we wanted to see what they were doing, or how they were dispersing. So our first criteria was, are they an adult that's at least 4 years of age or older, based on the molt, their molt patterns. Then we looked at, plumage characteristics. Are these the type of birds we want to see where they're going? And then finally, if all those checked out, is the bird healthy? Does it have parasites? So kind of all those three things in conjunction. So luckily, we had a big enough sample size where we could be very meticulous about the birds that we were selecting for.
Yeah, that's a great sample size. So you talked about aging them. Larry's wondering what criteria you used for determining the sex of the birds. Was that just size and weight generally?
Yeah, so when we catch them in hand, we record the sex as unknown because there is so much overlap in the morphometrics with red tails. Um, but we kind of have a hunch, some birds are really small and we're like, this is probably male in hand, and some are really large and like, this is probably a female. And now that we've actually been tagging red tails up in this region for, or at least banding them for over 4 years now, we're kind of starting to get a good sense of what the morphometrics are like. But we don't really, we won't with confidence say that until we get the data from the breeding ground. So when these birds come back, we see the males, they're a lot more dispersed, doing food deliveries, not as much incubation on the nest site, as opposed to the females where they're, during the incubation stages, they're there for a long time. And then of course, with our, with the red-tailed hawk project, I'm taking blood samples for them. So we're confirming all this through blood analysis to make sure we're correct on sex. But in hand, we're just like, yeah, it's probably this or that, but we just say unknown, and we just do our best to guess that we're getting an even sample of males and females.
Okay. All right. Cynthia is wondering how far north are the cell towers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I spend a lot of days when these birds check in and I'm like, how is that bird checking in? And I try to find Canadian cell tower maps and look, and these transmitters have been working incredible. I don't know how close they have to be to the cell tower, but some of those I've had, that one bird, which was from this year that was near James Bay, it transmits every week. So I don't know if there's just like one random cell tower up there that it's able to bounce off of, but I don't think there's a lot, but I just would like, I guess I would say that the transmitters are just working so well that if there's something in relative proximity, they transmit. But then again, on the other hand, we have some birds that, they came back from their wintering grounds and you're like, oh, that's weird. Why didn't they transmit? But maybe they're just in a dead zone. So it's hard to say. It's just kind of random, and sometimes I'll hear from birds that I just don't expect to hear from throughout the summer because they were flying, maybe they're up high flying around their territory, or who knows. So I don't really know, even though I've looked hard.
Yeah. Jerry is asking, are there subspecies variations at the site? You touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's one of the things, when I initially thought, we just kind of assumed, that these were probably all northern birds. But, we do catch a lot that fit that classic Alioto, that northern subspecies, but we really catch this kind of, regional type that's a lot more lighter, but they have these northern traits. So, my collaborators, they're going to be looking at, the genomics and kind of, looking at the phylogeny of all these subspecies. So for us, we definitely get the northerns, but is there a gradient of northern birds that are coming through? I mean, that's what it looks like, just based on their breeding locations. They don't necessarily fit the typical criteria we would expect for northern bird, but they're going to these locations that just by their breeding location would make them northern birds. So that's been really interesting. And this year we also if we get something that's kind of wonky, has different traits that maybe don't perfectly align, we would say, let's see where it's going and what its breeding ranges and just kind of its migration. And also, the eastern subspecies, the borealis, it seems like we do get some of them up in the Straits. The last bird that you see here in this picture, actually, that bird pretty much everything, tusk looked borealis, except it's kind of had some funkiness in the tail with all that banding. And then when it crossed, we're like, oh, well, this bird's going pretty far north, and we didn't really know what. I kind of expected it to stay in the lower peninsula. So, I guess pretty much two subspecies. And then we've caught birds that we thought have had Harlan traits too, off and on, which has been really interesting. And we've taken blood from them. So, really interesting spot for a lot of different red tails for sure. A lot of variation in the area.
Very cool. Okay, next question. Leah is asking, how do we report birds? How do we report that we've seen a banded bird?
Yeah, so if you see the color banded, you can go to, I believe it's the USGS Report a Band website. I guess I should have included that. But if you type in, report a bird band with USGS, you can go in there, and then it has a bunch of drop-down menus. You can fill out and say, the species you saw, so red-tailed hawk, and you can actually put in the color band combo you saw. And then it'll give you information on when it was tagged, and you'll get a nice certificate too for reporting it. So hopefully some of the people tuned in, you'll see some of these birds. We're hoping.
Yeah, I hope so. A few more questions if you're up for them. I think we have time.
Yeah, definitely.
Yvonne asks, is the bridge structure such that a tired redtail can land on it?
Yeah, the bridge is really big. It's about 5 miles. It's actually one of the longest, if not the longest. I should know that. I'm up there in North America. And so, yeah, I guess they could land on it. I've actually never seen a red tail land on it. There's peregrines that have tried to nest on it, I know. And in the winter, you see snowy owls sometimes sitting on it. But as for red tails, it seems like, they just, as soon as they get up there, they don't want to, they just want to get across if they can. They don't want to stop if they don't have to.
Right. Okay. And Cynthia asks, for nesting sites much further north, are they still using trees?
That's a good question. The satellite imagery isn't super high resolution up there, so I've tried to zoom in, and I can't tell. Some of the spots are in, like, you can tell there's like little forest patches that they're in, but some of them it just looks kind of open. So I'm not entirely sure what they're nesting on. That it would be interesting to be able to go up there and document these nest sites, because a lot of those sites are really, we weren't expecting them to be in these areas. So it could just be flat. Maybe there's just like one black spruce or tamarack in the whole, area that's just tall that they're nesting in. I'm not 100% sure. I've tried to zoom in on Google Earth, but you only go so far, and then it says images not available. So not 100% sure what they're doing. I would presume they're probably up high on something, but
yeah. Okay, a couple more coming in. Yvonne is asking about owl migration. Do owls generally migrate at night? These are probably local birds. Not sure about their migration movement, but yeah, I'm not really sure. Do owls generally migrate in darkness? So I don't know are great horns migrating that you know of, or just local birds?
yeah, I don't think great horns aren't migratory. They're just they stay on the same spot.
Right.
Yeah, they do. There's owls that move through here, but yeah, not great horns. If anything, it's
Not
just
the great horns.
just kind of juvenile dispersal, if anything, up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Esther is saying she's recorded red tails in Northwest Colombia, in South America. Any thoughts on that migration? We need some transmitters on those birds.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know a lot about them. I mean, it seems like, some of the, I would assume that maybe they don't migrate just because it's good climate, it's a good conditions year round for them. It's just kind of like that, the subspecies in Florida, they stick on the same areas year round. There's no need to move. And even some of the birds here in southern Michigan, there's pairs that just stick on the same territory. You see them year round. So I don't know about there. Yeah, it'd be interesting to get some movement, see what they are doing. Because here what we're seeing, it's kind of like a leapfrog migration. We're getting these migrants that kind of jump over the residents, which is cool to document. So down there, yeah, I've no idea what they're doing. That would definitely be cool to get down there and put some transmitters on them for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen a few on migration, counted a few in Central America, very few. Okay, last question, fascinating research. Bernadette says, how can you tell if a bird is nesting? Is it just lack of movement?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. So luckily when these birds are up on their breeding grounds, there's a lot of sunlight during the day, so the transmitters are fully charged. And so when the bird gets up and moves, a sensor turns on and it takes a point every minute. So it gives us really fine scale movement of what they're doing. And so when the bird's nesting, we can tell because they're in a really confined location. For the most part, their territories don't seem to be bigger than a few miles in radius. And we see a lot of visits to the same spot. So we see, tracks going out and then coming back to the same spot, going out, coming back. So we just, kind of assume that that's where their nest site is. And then with the females, yeah, you'll just see them literally sitting on the same spot for hours and hours and hours. And then, they'll move a little bit, then come back, sit there for hours and hours and hours. So that's kind of our criteria for determining if we think they're nesting there, until they settle on in a central location.
Okay, great. Well, I think that wraps up the questions. Those were some great questions, and thanks for taking the time to speak to us, Nick. I'd love to hear more about your research, follow some of those links, people, and check out what he's seeing. It's such a fascinating project, so I can't wait to hear more about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me and presenting. It was great.
All right. Well, thank you. Just to echo what Julie said, yeah, thank you so much, Nick. It's just really fascinating to hear that. And I'm sure it's just the tip of the iceberg. But, also our sincere appreciation for the time that you clearly put into making this presentation. So such high quality. And you're a really great speaker as well. So I wanted to mention that. So thanks for all the hard work that you put into that. And if we go to the next slide, folks, we can see what we're planning for next month. We're going to welcome Gail Walter from Southwest Michigan, who has a wonderful presentation on bird-friendly building design. And she also touches on things that we can do as homeowners to help protect the birds that are coming to feeders and around our homes to keep them from colliding in our windows and things like that. So it's a really fascinating talk. I think it's going to be really great. A little bit of a departure from a Raptor related presentation, but something I think that all of you will really enjoy. And the last thing that I would say is just, as always, remember HMANA, much like MSRW, is a nonprofit organization that is all about conservation, education, and research. And we just ask that if you really enjoyed today, feel free to go out to HMANA.org/support and think about supporting HMANA financially through the way that we like to describe supporting Raptors. So again, thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you next month. Have a great day out here.